U.S. Navy called his diving bell Impractical. Then it saved 33 sailors from the ocean floor. May 23, 1939. 0740 hours, 47 miles southeast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The pencil trembled in Lieutenant Oliver Naquin's hand as he marked the dive log, recording what should have been routine: a test dive, the 19th successful descent for the newest submarine in the United States Navy fleet, the USS Squalus. 310 feet of cutting-edge naval technology, commissioned just 2 months earlier. Everything indicated readiness for a safe dive. Naquin stood at the diving control station in the control room, watching his crew execute their duties with precision. At age 35, the Louisiana native had earned his reputation as a strict disciplinarian. Every action his sailors took while diving was crucial. A single mistake in these iron coffins could doom them all. Submarining in 1939 remained what sailors grimly called the coffin service. Between 1921 and 1938, 825 men had died in 18 submarines from various countries. Heroic rescue attempts had always failed. 63 feet into their descent, a voice cracked through the intercom from the engine room, the words that would haunt Naquin for the rest of his life. "Take her up." The inductions open. Seawater sprayed throughout the aft compartments. Naquin's training took over instantly. Close all watertight hatches. The massive steel doors slammed shut throughout the submarine, sealing men into their compartments, some to safety, others to death. The forward compartments where Naquin stood would become a tomb or a sanctuary. The answer depended on men who at that moment had no idea the Squalus had just sunk. Within minutes, the submarine settled keel down on the Atlantic Ocean floor, 240 feet beneath the surface. 4 compartments flooded, 26 men dead, drowned in the ice-cold water that had poured through the failed engine air induction valve. In the forward compartments, 33 men remained alive, 32 crew members and 1 civilian, naval architect Harold Preble, who had been overseeing the submarine's test dive performance. The surviving men found themselves in 3 forward compartments separated by watertight doors. The control room held Lieutenant Naquin and most of the officers. The forward torpedo room contained sailors who had been preparing equipment. The forward battery compartment housed others. They huddled in darkness as the temperature dropped. Ice began forming on the bulkheads. The submarine's interior, normally kept at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted toward freezing as the Atlantic's 34 degrees Fahrenheit water leached heat through the steel hull. The toxic air caused some to vomit. Carbon dioxide levels rose with each breath. The chemical carbon dioxide absorbent canisters could only do so much. Some men developed splitting headaches. Others felt dizzy and disoriented. The chlorine gas from seawater contaminating the battery cells added another danger. Sailors worked frantically to isolate the batteries and prevent a catastrophic explosion. Their quick action saved lives even as the air quality deteriorated. Naquin ordered his men to stay calm, to lie down, to try to rest, not to talk. They needed to preserve their strength and conserve the limited air. He calculated they could last 48 hours if they didn't use too much oxygen. The men lay on the cold deck wrapped in whatever clothing and blankets they could find. Some prayed silently. Others thought of their families. Some kept checking watches, counting the hours. Others tried to keep spirits up with quiet jokes, though voices trembled. The Squalus had missed her scheduled communication check. 1 hour passed, then another. At Portsmouth Naval Base, Commander Cyrus Cole realized something was catastrophically wrong. He ordered an immediate and massive rescue attempt. The USS Squalus, the Squalus' sister ship, was dispatched to search for the missing submarine. But there was a problem that would prove nearly fatal. The Squalus' last transmitted coordinates were several miles from her true location. The Squalus searched the wrong area for hours. As darkness fell on May 23, the families of 59 men waited for news: wives, mothers, children. They gathered at the Portsmouth Naval Base, their faces etched with fear. The women stood together trying to comfort each other. They helped organize food and coffee for the growing crowd. In the submarine community, everyone knew the grim statistics. No crew had ever been rescued from a depth greater than 20 feet. At 240 feet, the Squalus crew was beyond any proven rescue capability. The submarine's designers had anticipated this nightmare. Built into the Squalus were emergency systems that now represented the only hope for the trapped men. Naquin ordered the release of a marker buoy attached to a telephone cable. On the side of the buoy, lettering declared, "Submarine sunk here. Telephone inside." The buoy broke the surface after midnight. The Squalus lookout spotted smoke signals at 0400 hours on May 24th. Then they found the bright yellow buoy bobbing in the choppy Atlantic waters. Inside was the telephone that rang directly to the submarine. Lieutenant John Nichols of the Squalus grabbed the receiver and quickly conveyed their dire situation: 33 men alive in the forward compartments, 26 dead in the aft sections, 240 feet down, air running out. Then he went to get Lieutenant Naquin. Naquin took the phone and greeted the Squalus captain, his voice steady despite the circumstances, but he had only seconds to speak before the cable snapped, cutting off communication. The trapped men were alone again in their iron tomb. Yet something critical had changed. The Navy now knew exactly where the Squalus lay. They knew men were alive, and they knew they had less than 48 hours to accomplish what had never been done before: rescue submariners from 240 feet beneath the ocean surface. 200 miles south in Washington at the Navy Yard, a phone rang in the office of Lieutenant Commander Charles Bowers Mommsen. The call that would define his legacy. Mommsen, nicknamed Swede, had spent years preparing for exactly this moment, a moment he prayed would never come but knew was inevitable. Mommsen had graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1919, 1 year early due to World War I. His path to submarine service began in 1921 when he entered the submarine school in New London, Connecticut. Within 2 years, he had his first command, the submarine S-15. September 25, 1925, changed everything. The USS S-51, sister ship to Mommsen's S-15, collided with the freighter city of Rome near Block Island. She sank in 130 feet of water. Mommsen was ordered to take his submarine to search for the crippled vessel. He found the oil slick marking the spot. But without sonar, there was no way to locate the submarine on the bottom. No way to reach the trapped men. All 33 crew members died slowly as their air ran out. Mommsen stood on the deck of his submarine, knowing his friends were dying below him, and felt utterly helpless. That feeling sparked an obsession. He began working on rescue equipment during his off-duty hours. First came a one-man breathing device, an oblong rubber bag that recycled exhaled air using soda lime to remove carbon dioxide. The press enthusiastically received the device and dubbed it the Mommsen lung. Between June 1929 and September 1932, Mommsen developed and personally tested the lung at a depth of 200 feet. The Navy awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in 1929, but Mommsen knew the lung had severe limitations. It required the submariner to make a free ascent through water that could kill through pressure, temperature, or the bends. What he really wanted was a way to bring rescue to the submarine itself. He conceived a diving bell that could be lowered to a submarine in distress, mate with an escape hatch, and allow trapped submariners to climb inside without ever entering the water. In 1926, Mommsen proposed the adoption of a diving bell for submarine rescue purposes to the Bureau of Construction and Repair. His drawings were reviewed and returned with a single word stamped across them: impractical. Then in December 1927 came another disaster. USS Squalus sank off Cape Cod after being accidentally rammed by a Coast Guard destroyer. The submarine bottomed in 110 feet of water. 6 sailors in the forward torpedo room were initially alive. They tapped signals on the hull to Navy divers working in the brutal cold and tangled wreckage. The tapping continued for days. Divers could hear the men inside begging for rescue, but a storm forced a stop to the salvage attempts on December 24th. All 40 men aboard the S-4 died. The public was outraged. The Navy was humiliated. And Charles Mommsen was more determined than ever. Mommsen returned to his diving bell idea in 1930. He built a prototype using a watertight aircraft hangar from his old submarine, the S-1. He tested it off Key West, Florida. The initial results were discouraging. Mommsen found the bell unstable. It tipped. It leaked. But before he could make the necessary modifications, the Navy ordered him to the Bureau of Construction and Repair to teach submariners how to use the Mommsen lung. He needed someone he trusted to complete the diving bell revisions. Lieutenant Commander Alan Rockwell McCann was put in charge of the final modifications. Naquin worked from July 1929 to July 1931 in the maintenance division at the Bureau of Construction and Repair. He incorporated all of Mommsen's recommended changes plus additional improvements: a floor bulkhead to prevent tipping, a pneumatic winch for better control, a pressure seal allowing direct transfer of survivors to the diving bell in a dry environment, and a rubber gasket embedded into a circular groove on the bottom edge, creating a watertight seal when pressed against the flat mounting ring welded around submarine hatches. When the redesigned diving bell was completed in late 1930, the Navy introduced it as the Naquin Submarine Rescue Chamber. Through the early 1930s, Naquin rescue chambers were built and distributed to submarine rescue ships. The USS S-4, raised and reconditioned after the disaster, became a floating test laboratory. Mommsen went to sea aboard her to conduct practical experiments and training with the rescue chambers. But by 1939, despite years of training, the Naquin rescue chamber had never been used in an actual emergency. It remained theoretical, unproven. Some in the Navy brass still considered it unnecessary. Now, at 0400 hours on May 24, 1939, Lieutenant Commander Mommsen received the call that would prove either his vindication or his greatest failure. Mommsen grabbed his diving equipment and assembled a team of the Navy's best divers. They jammed into a convoy of cars escorted by local and state police. The convoy screamed up the coast from Washington to Portsmouth, a distance of over 400 miles. They were traveling so fast that the police escort couldn't keep up as they passed through Boston. Red lights were ignored. Intersections were blocked for their passage. Mommsen and his team arrived at Portsmouth at 0415 hours on May 24. They had made the journey in record time. But would they arrive in time to save the 33 men trapped beneath the Atlantic? Meanwhile, the submarine rescue ship USS Falcon was racing north from New London, Connecticut, 200 miles of ocean away. The Falcon was a 187-foot minesweeper that had been converted for submarine rescue operations. On her deck sat the untested Naquin rescue chamber that Mommsen and Naquin had spent years developing. The chamber was 10 feet high and 7 feet wide. It weighed 21,600 pounds. 2 compartments, upper and lower, separated by a floor bulkhead. The lower compartment would mate with the submarine hatch. The upper compartment would carry survivors to the surface. The Falcon maneuvered over the Squalus location on the morning of May 24th. The marker buoy bobbed nearby, its telephone cable severed but its position marking the submarine's location. Commander Mommsen took charge of the operation. His first task was to send divers down to confirm the submarine's exact position and condition, to attach guide wires that would allow the rescue chamber to descend directly to the escape hatch. The divers who would make this dangerous descent understood the risks better than anyone. 240 feet represented the extreme limit of diving operations in 1939. At that depth, water pressure reached over 100 pounds per square inch, 7 times normal atmospheric pressure. Every breath required enormous effort. The human body was not designed to function under such crushing force. Divers had to overcome their body's natural panic response. Their chests compressed. Their lungs struggled to expand against the weight pressing down on them. The sensation was of being slowly squeezed in a vice. The cold Atlantic water hovered just above freezing, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. A diver's body temperature would drop rapidly despite the insulating layers of the canvas suit. Hypothermia could incapacitate a man within minutes if his suit flooded or tore. The lead boots and brass helmet that protected him also conducted cold directly into his body. Feet went numb within 20 minutes. Hands lost feeling and dexterity. Simple tasks like tying knots became nearly impossible as fingers stiffened. But the most insidious danger was nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep, divers called it. At depth, nitrogen in compressed air dissolved into the blood and brain tissue, producing effects similar to alcohol intoxication. Judgment became impaired. Simple tasks became impossibly complex. Some divers experienced euphoria and removed their helmets underwater, convinced they could breathe the water. Others hallucinated. Still others became paranoid. Nitrogen narcosis had killed experienced divers at far shallower depths. The narcosis began around 100 feet for most men. By 200 feet, it was severe. At 240 feet, divers operated in a dreamlike state where thoughts moved through molasses. Every action had to be planned in advance, rehearsed mentally, because in the moment of execution, the diver might forget what he was doing. Momsen and his team had pioneered the use of helium-oxygen mixtures that reduced nitrogen narcosis. By replacing nitrogen with helium, divers could maintain better mental clarity. But even with this innovation, 240 feet remained extraordinarily dangerous. If a diver ascended too quickly, nitrogen bubbles would form in his blood and tissues. The bends, officially called decompression sickness, caused excruciating pain, joints locked, blood vessels ruptured, paralysis, death. Divers needed to make carefully timed decompression stops during their ascent, spending minutes at specific depths to allow nitrogen to safely leave their systems. But in an emergency, when air was running low or equipment failing, those stops might be impossible. The diver had to choose between probable death from the bends or certain death from drowning. Visibility at 240 feet was measured in inches. The Atlantic waters of New Hampshire carried sediment and plankton that scattered light. Even with powerful underwater lamps, divers often worked by feel alone. They could not see their own feet. They navigated by intuition and experience, feeling their way along guide ropes, trusting their training. The water current could grab a diver and slam him into the submarine hull or tangle him in cables. The massive steel hull of the Squalus loomed in the darkness. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and a diver could become trapped beneath the submarine or lost in the infinite black of the Atlantic. The guide ropes were their lifeline. Without them, a diver could swim in circles, unable to find the submarine or the surface until his air ran out. Chief Torpedo Man Martin Sabatsky volunteered to go first. He had trained for years in deep diving operations, but training and reality were vastly different experiences. If Sabatsky failed to attach the guide wires correctly, the rescue chamber might not mate properly with the submarine hatch. The entire rescue could fail. 33 men would die. The weight of that responsibility pressed on Sabatsky as heavily as the water pressure would press on his body. He suited up in the heavy canvas diving suit, brass helmet, lead boots, air hoses, and communication lines were checked and rechecked. The helmet was lowered over his head and locked to the suit's collar. The faceplate was secured. His breathing echoed loud in the enclosed space. At 1,100 hours, Sabatsky began his descent into the black water. On the Squalus, the 33 survivors heard the hollow clang of lead boots on the hull. They cheered. Someone had found them. Sabatsky worked in pitch darkness, his hands numb from the cold attaching guide wires to the submarine's forward escape hatch. The hatch had been specially fitted with a flat mounting ring, a modification implemented across the fleet specifically for the McCann chamber. His movements were slow and deliberate. Each action had to be perfect. He could feel the nitrogen narcosis beginning to affect him, a pleasant floating sensation that he knew was dangerous. He forced himself to focus. One cable, then another, then a third for redundancy. He tested each attachment, pulling hard to ensure it would hold. Finally satisfied, he signaled to be brought up. The ascent took longer than the descent as he stopped at each decompression depth, but he returned safely to the surface. The path was ready. At 11:30 hours, the McCann rescue chamber began its first operational descent. Not a training exercise, not a test, a real rescue with real lives depending on every action. The chamber hung from a cable attached to a winch aboard the Falcon. As it descended through the green-black water, its two operators inside experienced increasing pressure that made their ears pop and their breathing labored. The chamber's steel walls groaned and creaked under the mounting external pressure. At 240 feet, the water pushed against every square inch with crushing force. Two men rowed inside the chamber, Torpedo Man's mate John Mihailovsky and gunner's mate Walter Harmon. Both had trained extensively with the rescue chamber. But like Sabatsky, they faced the reality that no amount of training could fully prepare them for this moment. They were about to attempt something that had never been successfully accomplished in human history. If anything went wrong, if the chamber flooded or became stuck, they would die along with the men they were trying to save. They brought supplies the survivors desperately needed: hot pea soup in insulated containers still steaming despite the cold, sandwiches wrapped carefully to stay fresh, milk in bottles, extra blankets and flashlights, medical supplies in case of injuries. These simple items represented more than physical sustenance. They were proof that the outside world had not forgotten the trapped men, that rescue was actually happening. The descent took nearly an hour. Mihailovsky and Harmon monitored gauges showing depth, pressure, and ballast levels. They communicated constantly with the Falcon above through a telephone line. Every few feet, they adjusted the chamber's buoyancy by bleeding air or taking on water. Too much positive buoyancy and the chamber might shoot to the surface uncontrollably. Too much negative buoyancy and it might plunge to the ocean floor. The operators needed to maintain neutral buoyancy, allowing the cable to control their descent while they made micro-adjustments. The chamber had a complex ballast system that required constant attention. Water could be admitted into tanks to increase weight. Compressed air could be blown into the tanks to expel water and create buoyancy. The operators had to calculate these adjustments precisely. Too much air and the chamber would rise too fast, potentially breaking the cable. Too little air and the chamber would sink too fast, potentially slamming into the submarine hull. As the chamber descended along the guide wires that Sabatsky had attached, the two operators carefully managed the ballast. They could feel when the chamber contacted the guide wires, a slight vibration transmitted through the steel hull. This feedback told them they were on course, descending toward the correct location. Without the guide wires, finding the submarine's escape hatch in the darkness would be impossible. At 240 feet, the chamber made contact with the Squalus hull. The impact was gentle but unmistakable, a soft thud as steel met steel. Inside the submarine, the trapped men felt the contact and cheered weakly. Their voices were hoarse from dehydration and the toxic air. But the sound of the rescue chamber arriving gave them strength they thought they had lost. Mihailovsky and Harmon now faced the most critical phase of the operation. They needed to position the chamber precisely over the escape hatch, a few inches off-center, and the rubber gasket would not seal properly. Water would flood into the chamber and submarine when they tried to open the hatches. The fourth descent began at 1841 hours. Everything proceeded normally. The chamber descended along the guide wires, made contact with the hull, sealed. The last 7 men climbed inside. Lieutenant Naquin, the last to leave his submarine, sealed the hatch behind him. He took one final look at the control room where he had commanded the Squalus for 2 months. Then he climbed into the rescue chamber. The chamber began its ascent toward safety. Then disaster struck. The steel cable connecting the chamber to the Falcon became fouled. Something had gone wrong with the winch mechanism. The chamber stalled at 100 feet below the surface. Inside, the 7 survivors and 2 chamber operators realized they had stopped moving. The cable was twisted, damaged. If it snapped completely, they would plunge back to the bottom. The chamber would be crushed by water pressure. Everyone inside would die. On the Falcon, Mommsen and his team worked frantically. They could not risk pulling harder on the cable. It might break completely. They needed to lower the chamber back to the submarine, level the load, and somehow fix the fouled cable. 2 divers prepared to descend in the dark. Night had fallen. The seas were rough. Diving conditions were as bad as they could be while still attempting work. Chief torpedo man Walter Squire volunteered first. He descended through the black water, fighting the current. He found the fouled cable wrapped around itself, kinked and twisted. He worked to remove it, but he could only partly succeed. His efforts sent the chamber bouncing across the Squalus hull. The men inside were thrown about. Some were injured by the violent movements. Torpedo man's mate Jesse Duncan was sent down next to remove the half-broken wire completely. Duncan descended into the darkness, his powerful underwater lamp barely penetrating the murk. He found the cable and began working on it, but Duncan became entangled in the cable. His air hose wrapped around the twisted steel. He couldn't free himself. Running out of air and delirious from nitrogen narcosis, he barely made it back to the surface alive. He was hauled aboard the Falcon unconscious and required immediate medical attention. A 3rd diver descended. He too was unsuccessful in freeing the cable. The fouled wire was too damaged to repair at depth in the darkness. The men in the chamber had now been suspended in the dark water for over 3 hours, exhausted, terrified. Some were suffering from carbon dioxide buildup as the air inside the chamber degraded. The situation was becoming critical. Mommsen made a decision that seemed impossible. They would manually lift the 21,600-pound chamber. 6 men on the Falcon took hold of the cable. Mommsen himself grabbed the cable alongside them. They pulled with all their strength. The chamber did not move. The weight was too great. Mommsen ordered the men inside the chamber to blow the ballast tanks for 15 seconds. This would increase the chamber's buoyancy and reduce the effective weight on the cable. The 6 men pulled again. Still too heavy. The chamber barely budged. Blow ballast for another 15 seconds. Pull. The chamber moved slightly, a few inches, then stopped. A third attempt. Blow ballast. Pull. The chamber began to rise. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the men on the Falcon hauled the chamber upward. Their arms burned, their backs strained. Their hands bled where the cable cut into their flesh. But failure was not an option. Men's lives depended on every pull. More sailors joined the effort. 10 men, then 15, all pulling together in rhythm. Mommsen called out the cadence, pull, rest, pull, rest. The chamber rose through the water. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. The cable creaked and groaned. Everyone feared it would snap at any moment, but it held. At 0030 hours on May 25, 39 hours after the Squalus sank, the rescue chamber broke the surface for the final time. Lieutenant Oliver Naquin and 6 other men were lifted onto the deck of the Falcon. All 33 survivors had been rescued. For separate trips to a depth of 240 feet. 13 hours of continuous operations. 33 lives saved. The device that Charles Mommsen had conceived after watching helpless as the S-51 crew died had finally achieved its purpose. The news spread across the nation and around the world. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the miraculous rescue. Photographs of the survivors wrapped in blankets arriving at Portsmouth Naval Yard became iconic images. The families waiting on shore erupted in celebration. Wives embraced their husbands. Children clung to their fathers. The relief was overwhelming. The Squalus rescue represented more than just 33 saved lives. It shattered the fatalistic assumption that submarine disasters meant certain death. For the first time in history, submariners had hoped that rescue was possible even from depths previously considered unreachable. The Navy moved immediately to expand the McCann chamber program. More chambers were built and distributed to submarine rescue ships around the world. Training intensified. Procedures were refined based on the lessons learned during the Squalus operation. The men who made the rescue possible were recognized for their extraordinary heroism. Chief Machinist's mate William Batters received the Medal of Honor for his critical decision to bring up more men than planned and his skilled operation of the rescue chamber under deteriorating conditions. Chief Torpedo Man John Mihailovsky received the Medal of Honor for making the first dangerous descent in the chamber and establishing contact with the trapped crew. Chief Boatswain's mate Orson Crandall received the Medal of Honor for his diving work attaching the guide cables under hazardous conditions. Chief Metalsmith James MacDonald received the Medal of Honor for his repeated dangerous dives, attempting to free the fouled cable during the final ascent. 46 others were awarded the Navy Cross for their roles in the rescue operation. Commander Cyrus Cole received the Distinguished Service Medal for leading the overall operation with skill and determination. Lieutenant Commander Charles Mommsen received commendation from the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Navy. Alan Rockwell McCann, whose modifications had made the rescue chamber practical, received recognition for his engineering contributions. Riding aboard the submarine Seawolf into the East China Sea, the Wolfpack tactic involved coordinated attacks by multiple submarines against Japanese convoys. The submarines under his command sank 5 Japanese ships totaling over 38,000 tons and damaged 8 ships totaling 63,000 tons. For this action, Mommsen received the Navy Cross. His final wartime assignment came as commander of the battleship USS South Dakota. Under his command, the mighty battleship supported operations on Eniwetok and Okinawa. The South Dakota provided naval gunfire support during the amphibious assaults, her 16-inch guns hurling massive shells against Japanese positions ashore. Mommsen rose to the rank of Vice Admiral before his retirement on September 1, 1955. He had served his country for 36 years. Charles Bowers Mommsen died of cancer on May 25, 1967, at Bay Pines Veterans Hospital in Florida. He was 70 years old. Fittingly, he died on the anniversary of the completion of the Squalus rescue, the achievement that had vindicated his life's work. The Mommsen Lung saved its first lives in combat conditions in October 1944. The USS Tang sank in 180 feet of water in the East China Sea after being struck by her own torpedo that circled back. 13 submariners used the Momsen lung to reach the surface in a desperate escape from the flooded submarine. The ascent was harrowing. Men had to equalize pressure, exhale continuously to prevent lung rupture, and fight panic as they rose through the dark water. Of the 13 who attempted the escape, only 5 survived to be rescued by Japanese forces. 3 others reached the surface alive but died during the night before rescue arrived, succumbing to hypothermia and injuries. The remaining 5 perished during the ascent. Despite the losses, the escape validated Momsen's original concept from 2 decades earlier. Without the Momsen lung, none would have survived. Modern submarine rescue systems are direct descendants of Momsen's innovations. Today's submarine rescue chambers can operate at depths up to 850 feet. The pressurized rescue module developed in the 1990s can descend to 2,000 feet and carry up to 18 people. These systems incorporate lessons learned from the Squalus rescue. Refined through decades of technological advancement, the fundamental principle remains the same. A pressurized chamber mates with the submarine's escape hatch, allowing survivors to transfer without entering the water. Every submarine in the United States Navy is equipped with rescue features that trace their lineage back to the modifications Momsen championed. Escape trunks allow personnel to exit the submarine individually. Mounting rings around hatches provide attachment points for rescue devices. Emergency communication systems include buoys that can be released to mark the submarine's position and provide telephone contact with the surface. These systems have saved lives multiple times since World War II. The technical innovations pioneered during the Squalus operation extended beyond submarine rescue. The use of helium-oxygen mixtures for deep diving developed by Momsen and his team revolutionized commercial and military diving operations. Nitrogen in compressed air causes narcosis at depth, limiting how deep and how long divers can work. Replacing nitrogen with helium eliminated this problem. Modern deep-sea diving, underwater construction, and offshore oil platform work all rely on helium-oxygen mixtures that trace back to the Squalus rescue effort. The salvage techniques developed to raise the Squalus from 240 feet became standard procedures for recovering sunken vessels. The use of external lifting pontoons, carefully calculated buoyancy adjustments, and staged descents with pressure equalization became the foundation of modern salvage operations. These methods have been applied to countless salvage operations in the decades since. When submarines and ships sink, salvage teams use techniques pioneered by the men who raised the Squalus. In 1985, on the 46th anniversary of the rescue, surviving members of the Squalus crew held a reunion in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Over 20 former crew members attended, some bringing their children and grandchildren to see where they had been saved. The reunion was both celebration and remembrance. They visited the cemetery in Kittery, Maine, where their 26 lost shipmates were buried. They stood together at the graves, old men now, honoring the friends who had died in the flooded compartments. They stood on the shore looking out at the Atlantic waters that had nearly claimed their lives. Some wept, others simply stood in silence, remembering. Alan Carl Bryson lived until December 1, 2008, the last surviving member of the rescued Squalus crew. He was 91 years old when he died, having lived 72 years longer than he would have without the McCann Rescue Chamber. Throughout his long life, Bryson attended reunions and spoke to naval groups about the rescue. He always emphasized the same message: the men who saved us were heroes. But the real hero was Swede. He never gave up preparing for a disaster he hoped would never happen. When it did, he was ready. Innovation often faces resistance from established institutions. Visionaries who challenge conventional wisdom are marginalized, their ideas dismissed as impractical or unnecessary. Yet history belongs to those who persist, who continue working when others declare their efforts futile, who prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Charles Momsen tested the Momsen lung on himself at 200 feet depth, risking his own life. He advocated for the diving bell despite repeated rejections. He trained diverse and refined procedures for disasters that had not yet happened. When the call came on May 24, 1939, he was ready. The submarine USS Squalus lies at the intersection of disaster and triumph. 26 men died in her flooded compartments, a sobering reminder that submarine service carries inherent risks. But 33 men survived because one officer refused to accept that submariners were doomed, because he spent years developing equipment others dismissed, because he prepared for the worst day of his professional life. When that day came, Swede Mommsen and his team achieved what was considered impossible. They brought every living soul to the surface. They proved that hope and human ingenuity could triumph over the crushing darkness of the deep.